Thank you very much, and I'd like to, boa tarde.
Boa tarde.
É um prazer participar nesta sessão e muito obrigado pelo convite. And now I'll switch to English so that our colleagues can also follow. And what I will do, I'm seeing that there is a bit of a bias towards economics and economists in the panel. So I hope that in the discussion we can keep some balance, but at the same time, I think we're taking also complementary approaches. So I think that the discussion hopefully will be quite rich. What I'm proposing here in a sort of very brief presentation is to start from work that I've been doing for some time, namely a collaboration that I've done and a project that I coordinated for the European University Association some years ago on funding mechanisms. And one of the dimensions that we looked at was precisely the growing emphasis on performance-based funding and the types of performance and the dimensions of performance that were identified and were promoted by funding mechanisms. And we think that this is quite an important aspect because the way institutions and individuals respond in the higher education system is of course largely influenced by what funding mechanism reward. Of course, we know that individuals and higher education institutions, academics and higher education institutions also respond to other kinds of incentives and other kinds of rewards, but financial rewards and incentives are very important. So as you are familiar, I mean, in many, my talk will be very much focused on the European experience and mainly continental European experience, but I'm sure that many of you will be able to relate to several things that I'll say. As you probably are familiar, we have seen a trend towards funding formulas. This in many ways was welcomed by many institutions because it brought more transparency to the system and also more predictability and a capacity for institutions to monitor how they could obtain more funding from public sources. And we also have seen a tendency towards output rather than input. So the first generation of funding formulas, mainly in the last decades of the 20th century, are very much focused on input indicators, quite often enrollment and so on. And then we've seen a trend in Europe towards output. And this was done through various forms. So we have seen this in funding formulas, but also we have seen this in performance agreements and contracts that were signed, that emerged and that were implemented in several higher education systems, and also in assessment exercises. And Professor Robin Mason already presented one of the most influential of those exercises, which started as a research assessment exercise and now as a slightly different name and also slightly different purposes, but has been also very influential in terms of the international higher education landscape. And when we look at the way this has been disseminated in European higher education systems, we see that nowadays there is a very large number of European systems that have some kind of performance-based funding. It doesn't mean that all the funding goes through these kind of mechanisms that is aligned with output and performance measurement, but it means that in some way, at least part of the funding is done through this, and quite often in a combination of input and output measures. And what we also try to map is which was the instrument that was privileged in terms of introducing performance-based funding. And as you can see from this slide, this was largely through formula funding, in some ways because you had already the structure, so people were used to this, and it was easier to start implementing sometimes overlapping input and output components, rather than creating a new type of instrument like performance agreements or assessment mechanisms. The other thing that we were particularly interested was in seeing what kind of indicators, and I think that part is particularly relevant for the discussion we're having today. And as you can see, A lot of the indicators, in some ways, you can see all of the indicators have a very limited relationship with the sort of the social engagement and the dimensions that we've been discussing. So a lot of that, the indicators are focused on teaching and research, and in some ways, what we see prevailing in most of the performance-based funding across Europe is a tendency to use those indicators that are easily available, and that of course tend to reinforce the importance of those indicators and that type of metrics in the system. A lot has to do with the number of students and increasingly the progress of those students and the graduation of those students. Quite often, many systems separate first and second cycle, meaning bachelor and master students, which are regarded more as a sort of teaching-oriented functions, from PhD graduates, which are more aligned with research output. There is a lot also linked to number of publications, quality of publications, and this quality of publications, of course, is very much linked to types of publications, citations, and so on. And in some cases, you have also the influence of peer review assessment. So the major concern I think we should have is that by focusing and by rewarding a lot the performance of institutions in this type of indicators means, of course, that you are signaling that these are the relevant dimensions that institutions should focus. And I think that the one growing concern in public agencies, but also in higher education institutions, is how do you broaden the perspective about performance? Because we know that in some ways, if we only count those kind of things, we are only covering one portion of one part of what universities do, and especially we have a very narrow perspective about what should be institution's mission. Another concern that quite often emerges related to this is that this tends to narrow and to create very strong forces towards institutional isomorphism or homogenization in the system. So if you want to have, and for a country like Brazil, and even for a large state like São Paulo, the idea that you should measure all institutions according to the same criteria is quite questionable, because the larger the system, you are expected to have very different types of profiles. You want institutions that some will emphasize certain types of missions, others will emphasize other missions, and even inside each of these missions, in education, in research, knowledge creation, service to society, you want to encourage them to differentiate and to excel in the dimensions and the parts of that they can be better. And part of the problem is by using the same criteria and by using these narrow definitions of performance, there is of course a strong force towards isomorphism. The other thing that we think that is important from the reflections that we've done on the basis of our research is that a lot of the indicators have created a drive towards reputation rather than development. So a lot of the gaming in terms of institution and inside each of the institutions is very much towards building a reputation according to rankings and according to that kind of criteria, and not really developing the institution or developing parts of the institution and individuals that are part of the institution, the research groups, the programs, in a way that they will add value to those communities and to the institution. And I think that has been a major concern at the policy level, but also at the institutional level. And because of that, we've seen significant attempts to start broadening the perspective of performance, but also to try to advance, because I mean, we need to move beyond sort of rhetoric that criticizes this. We need to start exploring, testing, first in a pilot level, and then expanding, reconceptualizing the way we can assess performance. And what I will do in the sort of the last couple of minutes in the my presentation is just to give you examples of studies that I think are already showing the relevance of this discussion at the international level in many higher education systems. And for instance, last year, the OECD published a study that was developed for several years, and that was coordinated by a colleague from that is now based in the OECD, but she's affiliated with our research center, CIPES, our colleague, Professor Claudia Sarrico. And this was very much exploring different ways of measuring higher education performance. And what they've done was also not only mapping the discussion in terms of the different missions that different higher education systems aim to fulfill, but also to develop with 4 countries or regions attempts to implement and develop these more diverse and these broader approaches to performance. And you have 2 examples here, one from Estonia that was very much focused on issues of accessibility through continuing education. Another example from Flanders in Belgium that was very much focused on the issue of sustainability. How can you measure the contribution and the performance of universities in that respect? And then the other 2 examples come from the Netherlands and Norway. In the case of the Netherlands, where the focus was very much on the policies to increase the social impact of research and how to better integrate higher education with its communities, its local and regional communities. And then in the case of Norway, how to foster entrepreneurship in terms of education, but also in terms of what higher education can do, not only through the teaching of its students, but also through research and interaction with the broader ecosystem. So I don't have time to go into detail, but I think that's not really the point of the discussion, but it's to show that there are clearly advances in several countries that have been exploring ways to measure performance in a broader sense. And finally, the other example that I would give is a joint project by the OECD and the European Commission, who has been promoting national reviews that is called Higher Education Innovate. And this has been done, this is a volunteer process that countries can propose, and they can choose from these various topics that are listed there in the slide, which ones they want to promote. So it's not the idea that one size fits all, but it's the idea that you have several dimensions that you want to encourage a more innovative attitude in your higher education system, in the universities that are part of the system. Which ones do you think are more relevant for the dynamics of the system and for the diversity of the higher education system? And they've been doing this in partnership with several countries, and you have also available some reports that either go into digitalization, in some cases internationalization, organizational innovation, entrepreneurial culture. So you have different dimensions that I think go beyond the traditional metrics and the traditional assessment of performance in higher education. And I think I'm just in time to finish, so we can have some time for discussion. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. And I know that I rushed through a lot of the presentation, but I'm sure that this leaves a bit of more time for discussion after a while. Thank you.